Now, I have a question to ask you this evening. What do all of these international locations have in common? Japan, Indonesia, Spain, India, Cambodia, the United States, Vietnam, China, the Cook Islands, and the United Kingdom all have in common. Well, yes, you'd be right if you said they're all locations that Airbus Albo has flown to on your dollar, nicknaming the plane after his puppy. But what they all have in common is that he has spent more time in each of those locations than he has spent as Prime Minister in Alice Springs. Now, last night, we told you that he flew in late afternoon, went to a controlled media appearance on a federal government-funded and subsidised building site. He then sat down with a conversation of a series of local leaders, from the mayor to some business leaders, and it was at 9 o'clock Eastern time yesterday when a social media video was released by the Prime Minister's office. Here he is, here to help. I'm just here to listen. Lots of the faces that you may have seen pop up here and there on Sky News. The Prime Minister was listening. The Prime Minister was there to help. Well, one of the people that you've seen an awful lot of here on Sky News, and one of the men who has kept an absolute relentless focus on the country knowing what's really happening in Alice Springs, is the bloke who runs the local bakery. Now, he was spotted in the video with the Prime Minister. He had a photo with the Prime Minister, like every citizen should. But what he had to say today about the meeting with the Prime Minister gives us an insight into how clueless Albo actually is about why he even needs to be there.
I explained that people had machetes held to their throats in their beds. I've told him about the women that have been in my shop crying because they've been broken into. They've had people in their beds. Mate, he actually didn't know how bad this was. He didn't know how bad this was.
Now, either he was lying in that conversation last night, or that's an insight into the bubble within the bubble within the bubble within the bubble that a Prime Minister ends up living in. The idea that this Prime Minister, in all of the times in the media, from breakfast television through to clickbait websites, endless radio interviews, and everything that we've been doing here for years, let alone what Jacinta Nampijinpa Price has been saying, first as a councillor, then, of course, in leadership on the Alice Springs Council, when she was running for the seat of Lingiari, when she was running for the Senate, when she became the senator, when she brought the victims of such violence to Canberra, or almost every significant speech that she made for a year about why the voice wasn't the right answer. Now, this bloke has either cut himself off from reality, or he has built all of these walls around himself that he's not seeing what's really going on. He's only seeing either what people are telling him or what he's willing to hear. Now, I put the challenge to the media that was going to be with the Prime Minister today in Alice Springs. Would they ask him about domestic violence? We showed you the numbers, not just in the Northern Territory, but in Alice Springs specifically. And well done to the person who asked him this.
Prime Minister, you'll be aware that in Central Australia there's some of the highest rates of domestic and family violence in the whole country. You yourself the other day said the government needs to do more in this space. Now, domestic violence advocates have repeatedly called for needs-based funding in the Northern Territory as opposed to population-based funding. Is now the time for you to take action on this?
Interesting what his answer is going to be. Is he going to speak the way that he normally does, that all men need to change and have the focus on the perpetrators needing to change? Well, will it surprise you that he speaks differently in Alice Springs than he did in Canberra or anywhere else, when the issues, of course, are significant for the Indigenous community?
Well, we've put $40 million additional funding into domestic violence and services just here in this community. And I note that before we came to government, that funding for local community services was about to drop off a cliff.
So we found a way to blame the previous government. He's been in charge for 2 years. He spent more time in all of those international destinations on individual trips, not collectively. Individually, he has spent more time in all of these different places than he has in Alice Springs. He turns it into an issue for the last government. But when he's away from Alice Springs, what's the message that he says?
Men need to take responsibility for their actions. They need to be prepared to speak about those issues, and where they see issues, be prepared to raise them.
But why not make the same point about Indigenous men? Now, obviously, men means all men. It means people from the oldest living culture to the people who arrived here yesterday, to the people who were born here, to the people who believe or don't believe in certain gods. It doesn't matter what your skin colour, race, etc., etc. But if all men need to change their attitudes when you're at a place that has such a high rate of it, why wouldn't you repeat that? Because, of course, maybe the Prime Minister isn't aware of it. Now, if that's the case, that's particularly frightening, but I think we both know that he is aware of it. There's just a different set of words that you use when you're talking to people in Canberra or Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, when you're on the national media, but when you're actually in the place where the demographics don't match the talking point, well, then suddenly we get blaming of the previous government. As for what he actually announced today, yes, a little more funding for this, a little more funding for that, but of course, the reality is that it's about the Prime Minister of the country knowing where the problems are in the country. And I will take Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price every minute of every hour of every day over the clueless performance from a Prime Minister who spends more time in Cambodia than he does in Alice Springs.
What's to actually show for that? 15 months ago, the Prime Minister was shamed into visiting Alice Springs, making an announcement of $250 million. But what did the now $300 million do in order to stop the riot that took place on our streets? This is what we need to understand. Where is the money being spent?
And just finally, to drive home the point about just how little time the Prime Minister actually spent there. Yesterday he flew in the late afternoon. This morning he did a press conference at about 9:30. He then was in Queensland by lunchtime. He didn't even spend a full day. Just as he spent more time flying to the tennis than he did on the ground, he spent more time in the hotel room than he did actually talking to people. And even when he spoke to those people, apparently he didn't even know what was really going on.